Ellens, you are the one who's going to start us with your presentation. So you can share your screen and start your presentation.
Thank you for inviting me to be one of the presenters of this webinars, and I'll be presenting on assuring sustainable water and sanitation systems in Africa. So from the concept note I received, so we'll be treating what is working, what isn't working, why, and what should be done to ensure it's working. And we'll look at the perspective, the African development diplomacy perspective, the climate justice perspective, as well as the inclusive governance perspective. So, from the historical background of WaSH in Africa, based on development literature, it shows that during the post-independence era, that is from the period of 1960s to the period of 1980s, many Africans prioritize development infrastructures. However, to continue, due to the recent urbanization as well as the population growth in Africa, as seen from the UN Habitat or as seen from the United Nations, Africa current population is estimated approximately 1.4 billion. And it also predicts that by 2050, Africa is going to reach approximately 2.5 billion. As a result of this brings a lot of pressure when we come to water services, sanitation, urban services, as well as hygiene in Africa. That is why the African Union, as the governing body of the continent, has prioritized inclusive participation in decision making as well as sustainable development in Africa. It is worth noting that water in Africa is not just a technical issue, it's not just a technical challenge, but it also stems or it's also influenced by the institutional transition or transformation in the continent. The water ecosystem of Africa, according to the World Health Organization, about 400 million Africans lack access to basic drinking water. Still, in that report, it also shows that about 700 million Africans lack improved sanitation facilities. From the statistics, we understand that it is not an issue of scarcity, but it is an issue of equality in the distribution of these infrastructural services or social services. Still, the World Health Organization also from the World Health Organization reports, it shows that Africa many Africans suffer from issues like waterborne diseases as well as child mortality as a result of this inequality. Therefore, it is necessary to assess or to address the issue of inequality when discussing climate or water infrastructure as well as the water crisis and reality in the continent. One of the issues that influence water security in Africa is climate change. We all know that climate change is one of the most issues discussed globally, and Africa to be precise. And according to the IPCC report, it shows that Africa commits less than 4% of the global greenhouse gas emission. Unfortunately, the continent is the most affected when it comes to the climate impact. Still, in that report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it shows that 40% of the African population in future, that's by 2030, will suffer from climate stress if the current adaptation strategy in the continent is not really into consideration or is not being improved on. Climate impacts such as increased drought frequency in semi-arid regions, flooding, contamination in urban water networks, reduced agriculture and reliability, as well as ecosystem degradation will be severe, though we are already facing it, but it's going to be really severe. And this also brings something, it brings a lot of burden to the government, just like the IPCC also in a report shows that by 2050 Africans will be spending 3 times what they are currently spending on health, education, as well as other infrastructure, only on climate adaptation impact. So it is really necessary for African governments, as well as the African Union and also civil society organization, to prioritize climate resilient strategies. When talking about water systems as well as hygiene and sanitation in Africa, development financing is also another, as the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. African countries, especially the highly indebted African economies, spend 60 to 70% of on debt servicing. This is a huge amount, which you and I know is really going to affect. It affects, not is currently affecting the fiscal space in ensuring social infrastructural development as well as investment in the continent. So it is by no chance, it is no doubt that debt distress affects sustainable development in a negative way. The issue of paradiplomacy and subnational governance. First, paradiplomacy, here we are talking about subnational actors such as cities as well as municipalities being included in the international scene, discussions in the international scene, or diplomacy, international diplomacy. And we all know, according to the United Nations Habitat Report, it shows that by 2050, about 60% of the African population will be living in the urban areas. This means that the urban authorities, like in the cities as well as other local authorities, need to actively take part in the international decision making of water, hygiene, and sanitation. But the reality is that this is not happening. And unless this is being taken, this is being given the seriousness it deserves, the future risks more stress or more water scarcity, as well as hygiene and sanitation and other infrastructural development. Youth and women are also being excluded, though they have a great influence in the water system as well as hygiene and sanitation discussion in the continent. But this group of people are being neglected. They are not really given the opportunity to participate and also contribute in international discussion with regard to this social infrastructural development issue. And it is predicted, according to the United Nations, that the continent is the youngest continent in the world. And this group of people, the women and the youths, are the ones who suffered severely when it concerns water collection and also hygiene and sanitation. Unfortunately, they are not really considered in the decision matters that affects them. They don't really take part in discussing this issue. They don't really, they are not in the negotiating table. They are being sidelined by government and other international institutions. So, after looking at the realities, the factors that are influencing water system as well as hygiene and sanitation in Africa, we look at what is therefore working in this the strategies that are being put in place. What is working? The first is the community-based water management. We realize that currently in Africa, communities are championing the the maintenance as well as other water governance issues at their local communities. They create committees that ensure maintenance as well as accountability for water management in their communities. Evidence also show that local ownership improves sustainability. This is also working in Africa, and the African Development Bank is also supporting or encouraging governments as well as institutions to encourage as well community-centered infrastructural mechanism. We also have urban innovations. We have countries like Kenya and Rwanda who are prioritizing urban sanitation partnership models, and also we also see like Malawi, those cities that are within the Lake Lilongwe, the maritime area. They are also prioritized. They are also engaging in partnerships to ensure safe catchments for their citizens. This is to provide water and also avoid conflict. This is another urban innovation. We also have entrepreneurship initiatives in waste management or waste collection. This is also working to an extent, and we also have the participation of private sectors to ensure service efficiency in these urban areas as well as in localities. What is not working? The first aspect, the first thing that is not working is infrastructural maintenance. We realize that most of our governments, African governments and African projects related to water systems, related to water crisis, they focus on construction of water catchments, construction of water systems that provide water to their inhabitants. Unfortunately, they don't really consider maintenance, which brings a sustainability gap in this aspect. It is evidence that most of these catchments, most of this installation no longer function after 5 to 10 years of their installation in these municipalities as well as local communities. Climate vulnerability is also another aspect that is not working. Our governments, or our governments as well as the African institutions don't really like, there's no reinforcement in the climate strategy, climate adaptation strategy. Though we have civil organizations like the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy Access, ASI, and also PACJA, that's the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, who are advocating with slogans like adaptation finance, more than doubling. They encourage, or they are advocating for governments as well as institutions, organizations, international organizations that prioritize climate adaptation to double the finances, since Africa commits less but suffers more due to not just geographical but also the economic situation of the continent. So they are advocating for more than doubling in adaptation finance. This is why this is not, because this is not considered, it affects the agricultural area, and it also increased migration as well as also rural livelihood. So it is therefore necessary for African governments as well as institution and civil society organization to prioritize or integrate climate adaptation strategies. We also have para-diplomacy gap. Like I said earlier, we are our cities and also municipalities are growing in a geometric progression. Unfortunately, these city authorities are not being given the voice, or they are not being given the opportunity to participate in international water negotiations. So it is really necessary for them to participate, because this is really not working. And looking at the statistics, future prediction on the population of the urban areas, it shows that if this is not taken into consideration, things will be worse. We have organizations like the C40 cities, creating initiatives like the C40 city climate leadership network, which brings cities to discuss issues of climate adaptation in Africa, in the continent, to ensure that Africans have safe water access. We also have the emerging and also growing organization, which I also represent, the African Para-Diplomacy Network, which is also advocating, trying to ensure that governments give these city authorities as well as municipalities the global space to interact among themselves, share ideas that will enhance safe water, hygiene, and sanitation in the continent, as well as other social infrastructural development. What then needs to be done in order to ensure that the African water system, as well as hygiene and sanitation situation, is being improved upon? First, finance and governance. African government needs to expand the climate adaptation. Like I once said, PACJA and ASI are advocating for more than doubling in adaptation finance. Africans governments also need to strengthen or encourage domestic resource mobilization, trying to mobilize resources in the continent that will enhance social infrastructural development, like access to water, as well as safe hygiene and sanitation. African governments also need to promote multi-level water governance, ensuring inclusive participation. Women, youth, cities, and other and municipalities, all these actors need to take part in the international water negotiation. What vision works then for Africans' water future? Africa needs to build, like I said, climate resilient infrastructure that are resilient in nature, that can withstand the climate hazards, which is more of adaptation, climate adaptation. Youth and women have to take up leadership in the water system, as well as hygiene and sanitation discussion at the international scene. Inclusive development diplomacy, where governments need to also include cities and municipalities, as well as researchers that focus on city sustainabilities, as well as decentralized cooperation, in ensuring that they share ideas and also they come up with good plans and strategies that will enhance safe water, hygiene, and sanitation in the continent. There is also need to restructure the global finance architecture. A global finance architecture, we are talking about the international finance architecture, which really favors the lenders and not the borrowers. Africans, like I said, most African countries spend 60 to 70% of their public revenue to service debt. This money could have been used to improve on the water infrastructure system, but this money is used to service debt. So it puts Africa in a very risky state when it concerns infrastructural development and water infrastructure to be particular. We all need to understand that water security is human security. To conclude, African governments need to understand, not just African governments, we all as Africans, both scholars, researchers, civil society practitioners, governments need to understand that the water crisis in Africa, the sanitation issue, as well as hygiene in Africa, is not just a technical or a historical issue or challenge. It is also a finance challenge. It is a climate challenge. It is a governance inclusion challenge. Therefore, Africa needs sustainable, just, and climate resilient water system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allens, for your wonderful presentation. We have seen how these challenges are intertwined, regardless whether you live in the rural area or the urban area. And I've seen how there are certain financing gaps, the climate risks, which hinder the resilience of water systems, and how governments and communities have to be accountable and the maintenance of these wash systems. I think we now leave this time to Ms. Elizabeth to kick off her presentation. Ms. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes.
I will carry on from where Ellen has left, and I will talk specifically about Kenya. And because he has mentioned it, this will be a good follow-up, just to show what it is we are doing in Kenya. As you can see from the slide, I'm talking about strategic overview of the wash landscape in Kenya. And I've described a perfect storm. That is where we are, at the eye of the storm. And I've given 4 points on where we are at the eye of the storm. And one of the reasons that I say we are at the eye of the storm, and especially in this time that we are supposed to be looking towards the 2063 agenda for Africa, is because there is rapid urbanization, and that rapid urbanization has not come in with infrastructure. So there is a lot of infrastructure strain with the urbanization, and that obviously limits the service delivery for the people living in those urban areas. The other one, as Ellen well put it, is the climate instability. And especially for Kenya, where there is a division between the arid and the semi-arid areas, the ASO counties. Kenya is swinging between historic droughts. 2025-2026 rains have failed. And this has depleted infrastructures like the water towers, as we'll be discussing later about the water towers in Kenya. So if you think about what is already happening with the climate instability and thinking about the water security in 2063, then we are looking at clearly challenges ahead. Then you have what we call the La Nina effect, the aquifer depletion, and especially when we have prolonged droughts that are not expected. And this creates what I would say in challenge 4, shift of emergency mode, because we are used of having cyclic periods of rain and drought. So when we have prolonged droughts, then we stop focusing on the planned or on the projected water services, and then we start having emergency fights for water security. And this gap is widening. The reality is what we project and what we are presenting becomes completely different because of this storm. The policy that exists and the operations reality are completely different. And that now affects our future water projections. And thinking about the infrastructure, what has happened over the years? Most of the African countries, like Kenya, were colonized. And most of the infrastructures that are existing for water delivery, most of them are as old as during the colonial times, when the populations, especially in the cities, were very few. So with these dilapidated infrastructures and all the other issues happening, then the projection of 2063 becomes a bit dim. And then there's the difference between sanitation and water. Over the years, and I know in most of the African countries, we are obsessed with how much we are spending on water. And the access to water has become there is quite a high disparity between water access and sanitation access. And that has its own problems, even in terms of the water supply. In Kenya, from the regulator's perspective, 59% of the population is accessing clean water, with only 29% accessing sanitation. And here, when we talk about sanitation, we are not even talking about safely managed sanitation. We are talking about basic sanitation. And that creates a difference, and especially when it comes to in rural areas where population use shallow wells, and with poor sanitation services, you can imagine what happens to the water quality. We have all these policies affect individual persons. whether it is a policy in sanitation, whether it is a policy in water, whether it is a policy in climate action. So when we have one policy that is not talking to the rest of the policies, then it is the human health that is affected, and the human cost includes illness, lost education, and mortality rate is high. So the critical disconnect of what we are having and what we expect to have in 2063 for us to be able to meet the climate, the expected water and sanitation agenda is, one, we need to match the expected infrastructure to what the objectives. The other two is we also need to think about what it is we are reporting and what it is that is expected. And number three is we have to match the infrastructure. We have to match the infrastructure, the water infrastructure with sanitation infrastructure, so that they stop working against each other in provision of proper water and sanitation services. The other challenge we've been having, and very important, especially when it comes to water services, is non-revenue water, or the physical loss of water. It has become a massive barrier of sustainability in water. The physical loss, which includes ruptured pipes, leaking connections, overflowing tanks, undetected bursts, just the water loss to the environment is very high. And this has created not only losses of water, but it has also created a lot of loss for the economic loss. There is the treatment plants, the treatment chemicals, and we are talking about losing 45% of the water that is properly produced. This is treated water with chemicals. It has come from catchment areas. It has been delivered by pipes, and we end up losing 45. So it is 45% of water that is properly treated. The other part of the loss, which we call it the lower loss, is the commercial loss, because as much as there is loss there, it is financial loss, but the water adds up with the consumers. And this happens through unauthorized thefts, faulty meters, meter tampering, and accounting errors. All this does not resort, the treated water does not resort to money, but it adds up at least with the consumers. And what does this mean for posterity? Number one, there is the economic loss. The economic loss not only to the people who are, to the resources that have gone into the treatment of the water, but also to the amount of, to people getting sick for not having sufficient water, for people, especially women and girls, taking so long to go and fetch water from distant places, and other things that are related to failure to have water. So this is not only about water loss, it is also, it has economic impact, and it also has impact on social equity. So what is the paradigm shift for Kenya to be able to achieve the 2063 goal? One of the things we are focusing on is we have stopped just thinking about construction, the pipes and the grey infrastructure. We have now started looking at the green infrastructure. We see water coming from the pipes or from the taps, but before it gets to the taps, it has a source, and that is the source that we are focusing on, what we are calling the green infrastructure. In Kenya, we have 5 water towers, and those 5 water towers include we have Mount Kenya, we have Mau. You may not know about them, but they are the highest peaks and where the forested areas where our water comes from. The focus has been that before we get the water to the pipes, we need to take care of the ecosystems. And I want to give 2 examples of what has been happening. Number one, we have been having the payment of ecosystem services. And one example that you can check in the internet is what we call the Upper Tana Nairobi Water Fund. And how it works is that we have the downstream users like Nairobi Water, Kenya Generation, Kenya Electricity Generation Company, contributing to the fund to pay the upstream providers, who are the smallholder farmers, to implement conservation and probably using terracing, grass strips, and agroforestry. Why is it important? it is important because the more turbid water we have downstream, the more we use for chemical treatment. Two, the turbidity also causes the volume of the dams to reduce, and therefore there is less water, causing intermittent supply in Nairobi and other key areas. From the Nature Conservancy, there has been results that have been very positive. They have spent about 20 million investment in the activities of catchment areas, but you have seen a return of 21 million, and this is just under 30 years. So you can see water conservation, green infrastructure has become much more important for sustainability than we ever thought of.
During my presentation, we had a slide for those things that were not working. So one of them were climate, which Elizabeth also added her voice to it. Climate adaptation to climate is one of the issues which is very critical and which is not really, which is like a hindrance to achieving what most of our African governments, Africa in particular, face. Is the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change. As a result of that, the adaptation strategies are not really sufficient, or they are not really the best, like I said, because they are not sustainable, they don't meet resilience. So that is one of it. The second is the debt dilemma. African countries most of the African countries are facing debt distress, and even those who don't face debt distress, they spend a lot on debt services. According to debt servicing, according to AFRODA, the global financial architectural reform, is a need to reform the global financial architecture because it favors the lenders and disfavors the borrowers, that's the Africans. So this is another area that is really affecting us. Another one is lack of inclusion. Youth and women who suffer a lot from climate, or who suffer a lot when it comes to water crisis in the continent, are not part of the negotiations. So there's a need for them to also participate. And like I said, our cities are at the core of this negotiation, though they don't participate, but they have a strategic role to play when it concerns the international water negotiation issue, but they don't really participate in this because they are being sidelined. So unless they are also being included in this, obviously this will continue to be another stumbling block for water accessibility as well as hygiene and sanitation in the continent. I don't know if your question is well answered.
I think you have illustrated how these gaps keep on progressing. Hello? Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I was saying that you have adequately addressed the question because you've illustrated how climate and lack of participation keeps on progressing the gaps that are based for these wash systems and how they are keeping on to be a challenge over time. So the next question is based on your emphasis on the climate risk and the resilience. So how best can communities or governance systems plan around that such challenge?
Please, can you take the question again?
As you're explaining about climate risks, how best can communities or governance systems integrate the resilience for this wash planning and infrastructure development?
Okay. Yeah. One of the most things we observe when it comes to the climate space is we try to copy a lot from the Western countries. Each environment have their own climate risks. Unfortunately, in the case of Africa, we try to copy a lot. Even when we don't really copy, we still try to the policies we should try to bring in the table are not really considered to an extent. So the first issue is trying to bring trying to take into consideration our climate realities. We as Africans, we have flooding in urban areas, we have prolonged droughts and all the rest. So we need to adapt first of all to this climate change. After adaptation now, we try to include every party in the discussion table. Most often, we see like these local authorities who also face climate disaster are not really considered. Their opinions don't really count. I was following a documentary from a researcher who was working with the World Bank when she was trying to encourage the traditional method of rotation farming in Africa in order to adapt to climate change. It was a World Bank project, but it was according to her, this project was being considered by the hierarchy as a low, a traditional project which doesn't really meet up to the expectation. But this was a project that has they have already tried to conduct the pilot stage of this project, and it was working in these African communities. But when she tried to, she did her research, everything, tried to suggest it to the authorities, it was not really considered. So they feel like the opinions of the Africans, those opinions that come from the Africans are a bit archaic. So they don't really, the adaptation strategies don't really meet African realities. So if these adaptation strategies meet our realities, obviously we are going to solve the issue of climate. Also, the issue of the global financial architecture when it comes to loss and damage. In the climate space, there is what we call loss and damage. Most often when Africans go to this international institution, financial institution like the IMF and the World Bank to seek funds in order to address the climate risks or disaster that has affected the continent, they try to come in the forms of grants. They try to come in the form of debts, of which other continents mostly have what we call the grant base. But we in Africa, we have the debt base. So trying to if we can solve that problem, maybe creating an African monetary fund that handles our climate risks also is really going to meet up to the expectation. And lastly, everybody, like I said in the beginning, I would like to emphasize on this, everybody is supposed to be part of the policy formulation process when it comes to climate, especially climate adaptation in the continent. The youth, the women, the scholars, everybody is supposed to partake in this in order to bring sustainable solutions. Those who are affected by this crisis need to be part of it, not sitting and waiting for, or not sitting and receiving maybe instruction from the top or solutions from the top, which necessarily doesn't really meet the African expectation. So I think if these issues are really considered, it's really going to help to address the climate issue in Africa.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Allens. I think we have seen how best we can work around with the gaps that we're seeing and how to show integration. I see there's a hand up. Achai?
Yes.
Can you express your question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Allens, for answering the previous question. And I'd like to thank Ms. Elizabeth as well for her presentation, and to Mr. Allen. I have a question for Ms. Elizabeth. She mentioned about she mentioned about water being lost to the environment, that we're losing about 45% of water to the environment. Are there ways that we can save this water and use it for, save the water and use it for the household, for other purposes? Thank you.
Miss Elizabeth, I think you can answer the question. Answer the question whilst pitching in some points. Yes.
Yes, of course, there are many ways of salvaging that water. And as Ellen very well put it, is because the reason we have that water loss is mostly because we don't involve everyone in decision taking. And when we don't involve people in decision taking, then they take everything for granted, or they feel not represented, and therefore they do not do the right things. If you look at the infrastructure, most of the infrastructure that is causing also this water loss, what we call the physical water loss, is because it was there far long time ago during the colonial systems. And remember that time, the population was very small. So as the population increases, the pipelines is being depleted, and many people are puncturing into it. So one, we have to renew the infrastructure if we are going to stop losing the water. And that calls for serious investments. And that is the reason why it has not been renewed. Because we don't invest sufficiently in the water sector. And that also, Alan said, it is mostly for most of the African countries, not only Kenya. When it comes to commercial losses, which is because of tampering, illegal connections, poor meters, poor billing, many of those things. Why do we rely on other people when it comes to production of meters? Remember, we have different water qualities from where the meters are done. So probably that is one of the reasons that the meters are failing in Africa, but yet they work where they are manufactured. Number two, why are we having people stealing water? Is it because it is too expensive for them? And when is it too expensive for them? Is it because they were not involved in decision taking? So we have to rethink the whole concept of water supply, water management, service delivery, and policy making. And if all that is done, I believe we can go as little as 5% in terms of water loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your brave answer. I think we can understand how best we can work around that. We have a participant from Mr. Fritz. Can you introduce yourself and answer and ask your question?
Thank you, colleagues. Let me start by thanking Nolens for inviting me to this webinar. I'm Fritz Ganje. I'm with the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. I've got two questions, although I think my second question wishes to go to both Allen's and Elizabeth. Elizabeth has somehow partly addressed the question, but that's why I start with that, because I felt that the question of governance was not properly addressed by both presenters. It was dealt with, I would say, peripherally instead of being grounded. I say that because currently in Johannesburg, where we've been having these recurrent water problems, and for anyone who can see, at the heart of it is it's not just technical questions; it's failures in governance. So I would like to hear more from both Allen's and Elizabeth how we can relate some of the challenges that you've identified to the fact that in most of our African countries, governance remains, or good governance remains a pipe dream, and that could be a major contributor to the water and sanitation challenges that we face on the continent. Specifically to Alice. Alice, I was hoping you will take us conceptually take us through the nexus between the internationalization of cities and other subnational governments and water governance. I did not quite get that connection, how through internationalization or paradiplomacy they could better contribute to water and sanitation governance in African countries. Thanks.
So can I respond? The moderator.
Yes, you can go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much, bro, for that intervention as well as question. Like you said, governance is an issue when we talk about water in Africa. The first thing we also need to understand is the Africa before independence. The governance structure which our colonial master left us is really what we are practicing. And time has evolved. There are a lot of things that have changed. Like, for instance, the cities in those days is not really, our cities are growing in a geometric progression, but service delivery is not really, it does not really meet up to this expectation. Our governments, like the national governments, don't really take into take this serious, like involving the sub national actors into play. For instance, I was conducting a research about decentralized cooperation and sustainable development, case study of the Limbe City Council. I realized that the issue of financing for development, which water was being mentioned in the research as one of the main issues that is being that is a challenge in that city. But the government, the city and the government, there is this collaboration is not really cordial. Water accessibility cooperation with other cities abroad, but because it didn't really meet the expectation of, let me say, the elite class or the political dons in the country, so they could not accept that. Our governments, our national governments and the sub-national governments, the relationship is not good. That is why we see cities, when there are certain times when they try to have this collaboration with cities out of the country or even within the country, but because of this fear or because of lack of autonomy, they cannot really achieve that goal. And now it stems to the issue, your question, which you talked about water and how the sub-national governments can address the issue of water crisis based on the international diplomacy. First of all, we notice that our sub-national governments don't really have the autonomy which they are supposed to have. So this already is a hindrance. They might have the ideas, but because of that lack of autonomy, they cannot really like excel, or they cannot really showcase their ideas when it comes to the level of the international. The issue of reliance on the traditional method of financing at the level of the local, at the level of the sub-national governments. Our cities rely mostly on the government, and like I said, this is also as a result of autonomy. I don't know, but to me, I feel like the government feels they feel that maybe their personal agenda might be conflicting, though in principle that's not the case. So they don't really give the autonomy to these local authorities, of which if these local authorities or sub-national governments are being given the opportunity to participate in international negotiations, first they are going to have exchange of ideas, maybe best practices. If any, maybe the city of Nairobi has something like a good practice when it comes to water management. Maybe the city of Yaoundé can also copy that from it. Also, capacity development, if they are being given the opportunity to explore the international scene, capacity development, because in the process of exchanging these ideas, maybe they can also have best ideas on practices that can enhance development, especially water development in their municipalities. Same, we also have resource mobilization, not just in terms of finance. When we talk about financing for development, we don't just rely on the physical, like the money itself, but we also talk about certain resources. For instance, in 2017, the Limbe City Council had a cooperation with the city in Coma, France, on risk and disaster management and currently that city is the only city in Cameroon that has a firefighting service in this whole of city. In the whole of Cameroon, other cities rely on the military. So such corporations might also regenerate or might also mobilize resources that will also enhance sustainable water management or construction of water systems in cities. But the lack of this autonomy is like a stumbling block that brings or that hinders the city from collaborating with other cities abroad. So if the government can give this autonomy to subnational actors to also air out, to also have a voice in this negotiation at the international scene, I think that situation which you said, which you mentioned, will be addressed. I don't know if your question is answered.
Elizabeth, I was referring to the centrality of governance failures in African countries in making sense of the water and sanitation challenges that we've got.
Okay. One of the reasons I think we need to discuss on the comparative pathways for the continent, so that we start looking at it from a country perspective. And when we look at the regional benchmarking on water sanitation sector, water and sanitation sector monitoring framework that was developed by AMCAO, it would allow the inter-country comparisons, and that can drive the government then will take responsibility of what are the comparatives that is happening, because it looks like national, at country level, the government may not take serious responsibilities on water and sanitation. But when there is a benchmark on what you're comparing yourselves on, then it becomes imperative that you want to do investment. The other thing is, how can we make the government stop focusing on just infrastructure alone and to focus wholesome from the sources, which is the catchment areas, to the system integration, to the management model? How can we do that? I think when we work as a continent, that it is not now me as a president of this country, but we are looking at it from different sectors, from different countries. Then we are able to marshal the political power in the management of water and sanitation. And I just want to make a very clear presentation of this last slide, which was the last in my presentation. If we stop just focusing on infrastructure performance, but we look at the non-revenue water, not just from the perspective of water is lost, but looking at it from the perspective of economics, a perspective of unauthorized consumption, and reducing not just the leaks, but also looking at it from the losses that come with it, including health, including agriculture and all that. Then we are able to just stop talking about we have lost water, but to look at it in a wholesome way to what are the other perspectives that we have lost. The other thing is, we are so used of looking at the water from the perspective of what is coming from the tap. And we forget that this water is created elsewhere, the catchment areas. And I don't know if this happens to other countries, but in the country I live in, which is my country, Kenya, we have gone to as far as even giving farmers the catchment areas to farm. What does that do to the turbidity of the water? What does that do to our dams? What does that do to our institutions, health institutions? Because if we don't take care of our catchment areas, that translation comes to the personal well-being of individuals, increasing the amount of money I spend as myself in a hospital, increases the crisis in the hospital. And we are always talking about curative healthcare. We don't look at it in the consortium or in the continuum from the catchment to what is happening in the institutions. So if we don't have a dedicated fund to take care of the catchment, it ends up that we have a dedicated fund to take care of sick people, to take care of health institutions, which is much, much more expensive. Are we integrating the systems? For us to integrate the systems, we need the political muscle, we need the political power, we need the political buy-in. Because the way we manage our services in most of the African countries is silos. Health is there, catchment is there, environment is there, water is there. So but if we have goodwill at presidential level, at very national level, then this continuum, this system integration then works, and there will be, we'll be able to aggregate all the elements to be able to achieve service delivery that is sufficient for everyone. And then this crisis of firefighting, we have crisis in water because there is drought, we have crisis of water because there is flood. We can translate the flood water to take care of the drought. But that doesn't happen, and it can only happen if we have the political will and the political power. And this is what we are talking about, the governance reform. How do we enforce the service standards and management practices? How can we operationalize accountability and standardize operations for predictable and effective service delivery? That can only happen if we have the political will and the political power to manage our sanitation, our water and sanitation services as we look forward to 2063. That is the only time that when we get to 2063, we shall be saying we have arrived where we wanted to go, and we have done it with this efficiently with the resources that we have. Otherwise, it will just be firefighting, or there is drought, we firefight, there is floods, we firefight, and the money that is supposed to go to strategy and management will not be available. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the wise words, as well as answering what Mr. Fritz had asked. I think we have exhausted our perspectives on how best we can strengthen and transform and address these WaSH challenges that have been persistent in most African countries. And I think what we can all agree is that what Kenya, Cameroon, or South Africa is experiencing is more or less one and the same thing. The gaps are more or less the same. So thank you to our esteemed presenters, Mr. Allens and Ms. Elizabeth. As we are concluding our session, thank you for everyone who has been patient with us, considering our technical challenges, the slight delays. As we conclude this session, we are going to share the policy brief, the meeting presentations that were from Ms. Elizabeth and Mr. Allens, as well as the meeting recording. I think we will share it along the week as we go. So thank you very much for this reinforcing discussion on how best we can achieve what we have illustrated from Agenda 2063 for the WaSH sector, how best to achieve safe water and sanitation, as well as how best we can move around these technical and systematic challenges. On a side note, before we end, we are going to host our upcoming webinar session on the 27th of March, which is based on the commemoration of the International Women's Day. So keep an eye on our social media platforms, which is Real Life Research Institute, African Programs, and we'll see you the next session. Thank you very much, everyone.